Yo, Speak Low Poetry, What Light Was. Today, it's the link from romanticism to the new romanticism of the first man of the jazz age, and the great link between. Distant waves, faint thunder. History doesn't die. It drowns, it burns, it chokes, it whispers. If you listen close enough, you can still hear its voice over the water. This is the opening to the true story of how a few wild romantics handed off their ghosts to the jazz age, and how one green light still blinks in the darkness. Today we start with where the chain began, the Gulf of Poets on the Italian Riviera, July 8th, 1822, the beach, the seabirds, the winds. It should have been a good day. The air was warm, the sea looked calm enough. Percy Bysshe Shelley, 29 years old, poet, revolutionary, philosopher, exile, climbed aboard his little boat, the Don Juan, named of course after Byron's infamous poem, and nicknamed the Ariel by Shelley's crew. Shelley, a cabin boy, and Edward Williams, who had attended Eton together with Shelley but didn't know each other till Italy until Edward was already a retired army officer. 3 men, 1 boat, no life preservers, no radio, just optimism, youth, and a romantic sense of invincibility. They never made it home. A storm swept through the Gulf, sudden, brutal, boat capsized. The sea took them. Shelley drowned. It would take them 10 days before the body washed ashore, unrecognizable, bloated, fish-eaten, crab-scavenged. But Shelley's pocket gave him away. A copy of Sophocles, and chillingly, also his volume of Keats. You don't need to invent tragedy. It writes itself. News of Shelley's death traveled fast. In Pisa, his widow, Mary. Mary's days become a living nightmare. In Genoa, Lord Byron, his closest friend, his intellectual rival, his fellow exile, went silent. But one man made his way to the beach to claim the remains. Edward John Trelawny. Now Trelawny, he wasn't a poet. He wasn't even much of a writer yet. He was a rogue, a sailor, a deserter, a gun runner, a man who would tell more lies than truths, but happened to stand closest when history made its move. It was Trelawny who built the pyres, burned the bodies on the beach. Lord Byron witnessed the horror. The fire burned hot. The fire burned quickly, but one part would not. Shelley's heart. The heart of the monster of England, of Percy Bysshe Shelley. His heart wouldn't burn. Trelawny burned his hand, plucking it out. The heart would eventually be wrapped in silk and buried with Mary and Percy's last child decades later. The eternal, indestructible core of the romantic myth. This funeral pyre wasn't just the end of Shelley. Keats' volume raged on this pyre too. It was the beginning of something bigger, something darker, a chain of beautiful doomed souls handing the torch to one another, a relay of tragedy that would stretch far beyond the 19th century. Shelley was only the first. Waves, wind, a faint bell ringing at sea. Some people are born famous. Some people become famous. And some people just show up at the right moment and refuse to leave. That was Edward John Trelawny, a man who inserted himself into the greatest literary story of his century and made sure you'd never forget his name. We meet Trelawny standing on the beach, pulling Shelley's unburned heart from the fire. But who was he before that? The answer? A ghost, a self-made story. A man who spent his entire life rewriting his own story. Born the same year as Shelley, Trelawny was the son of a respectable British family. But respectability bored him, rules bored him, England bored him. As a teenager, he ran off to sea, like Edward Williams, the Royal Navy, gunboats, battles, desertion, smuggling, foreign ports, foreign women, and just enough danger to keep it interesting. Or so he says. See, much of Trelawny's early life is fogged in contradictions. What we do know is that by his late 20s, he'd washed up in Italy, penniless but fearless, carrying stories and scars, and it was in Pisa where fate, or maybe sheer nerve, brought him face to face with Lord Byron. Picture it. The aristocratic Byron, Europe's most scandalous celebrity, lounging in Italian exile, surrounded by poets, mistresses, and revolutionaries. Enter Trelawny, rougher, hungrier, dirt under his fingernails, but sharp. The two men hit it off like flint and steel. Byron saw in Trelawny a younger, wilder version of himself, without the bloodline, but with the same taste for danger, and through Byron, Trelawny was introduced to Percy Bysshe Shelley. Now, Shelley was a different breed, quieter, more fragile, but no less intense, a radical poet, a man constantly chasing the perfect world and constantly being crushed by the one he lived in. Trelawny admired Shelley, respected him, and even protected him in his own way. He called Shelley the most guileless being he'd ever met, which translated from Trelawny speak means this man is too pure for the world. For months, they formed a strange little circle on the Italian coast. Byron, Shelley, Mary, Trelawny, drinking, riding, sailing, planning revolutions that would never come, living like titans before their fall. And then came the storm, the wreck of the Don Juan, the drowned bodies, the beach fires, the unburned heart. The tragedy made Trelawny a witness, but tragedy was only half the game. Now he would become something far more dangerous, a chronicler. When the dust settled, Trelawny began writing. The year Mary Shelley republishes Frankenstein, Trelawny publishes Adventures of a Younger Son. But don't let the title fool you. It wasn't just a memoir, it was a manifesto. Part biography, part swashbuckling adventure, part romantic fan fiction. He peppered it with 152 epigraphs, quotes from Byron, from Shelley, from Keats, creating for the first time the trinity we now know as the second generation of British Romantic poets. Shelley and Byron, sure, they were close. Shelley and Keats, they had met and written, and there was Adonias, but Byron and Keats, they barely exchanged anything but insults. However, Trelawny, in his sharp vision, Trelawny grouped them together, turned them into the brothers in ink, and that's the genius, or maybe the con, of Trelawny. He saw what history would eventually see, and he wrote it first. But Trelawny wasn't done building legend. After Shelley's death, he himself grew closer to Mary Shelley. The two lived under the same roof for a time, sharing their griefs and their ghosts. And when Trelawny finally returned to England, he embedded himself into the Godwin household, Mary's father, William Godwin, being another strange, radical pillar of the Romantic age. Godwin had connections to all three poets. Byron tried to finance Godwin's publications. Keats admired Godwin's mythological and psychological writings. And Godwin was Shelley's idol, and Shelley married his child. In Trelawny, Godwin found a kind of living bridge to the faded, lost younger generation, after the first romantics had now survived the second. But Trelawny isn't some monk. The man married many times, dueled over women, fought alongside Greek revolutionaries, dodged debts and lawsuits like musket balls. His personal life was one long, unbroken chain of chaos. And through it all, he kept writing, refining the myth, making sure the world remembered Byron, Shelley, Keats, the way he wanted them remembered. 1858, he published his Recollections of the Last Days of Shelley and Byron. That book would become one of the most influential and unreliable documents of the Romantic history. Byron as the tragic warrior philosopher, Shelley as the doomed angel, Keats as the silent, fragile spirit hovering behind them. Were Trelawny's stories true? Some were, some weren't. But history doesn't always reward accuracy. It rewards the man who tells the story the best. And Trelawny, he told it better than anyone. By the time Trelawny died at the age of 88, he had outlived all of them by half a century. They died young, he lived long, but he carried their ghosts. He was buried near Shelley and Keats in the Protestant cemetery in Rome, a fitting resting place for the man who made himself a final companion. But the chain wasn't done. The story Trelawny started didn't stop with Byron's exile or Shelley's drowning, because a century later, another young writer would stumble across Trelawny's books on the French Riviera, an author named F. Scott Fitzgerald, who will show us how American dreams are built on old European bones.